Hello and welcome to section 4 of Word VBA programming. In this section, we'll discuss ways of making your code more modular and efficient by separating different sections of code into different sub-procedures and functions. In this first video, we'll revisit a technique that we discussed briefly in section 2, whereby you can have one main sub-procedure that calls a series of subordinate subroutines. In this example, we want to record a macro, but to save messing up our template, we'll use a blank document. Although the steps that we'll be performing in the macro will be performed in this blank document, we still want our code to end up in our template. So the first thing we'll do is to attach the template to this new document. We go to Developer, Document Template, and Attach. And then we go across to our Exercises folder, which is on my desktop. And here's our template. When we go across to Visual Basic, you'll see here I've still got my section 3 module open. I'll just close that down and go into section 4, which of course is completely blank apart from our option explicit. And just to remind you why that comes up, Tools, Options, Require Variable Declaration, because that's switched on. Every new module will have option explicit inserted. Let me also remind you of a second way of attaching a template to a document, especially if it's a blank document. We find the template and we simply double click it instead of the usual right click and open. So here we've ended up with document 1, but because it's based on the template, when we go into Visual Basic, again we have access to our Word VBA training template. Let's close that for the moment and let's go ahead and record a macro. So what we're going to do is to take the example of a document that we need to create which tracks the creation of a series of reports. Each report, let's say, has an author who's responsible for its creation, and the document that we're creating will give details of each report, who is its author, when is it due by, and what percentage of the document is currently complete. So of course we begin by starting the macro recorder, and let's use our usual naming convention. So we're in section 04. This is video 01, macro A, and we'll call it main. We don't want to save it in the normal template. We want to save it in our Word VBA training template, which we can access by choosing this option. And let's begin by putting the heading that we want at the top of the document. Let's call it Report Creation Summary. And then let's make that line a heading 1. Then let's insert a blank line, or 2, and insert a table. So I'm going to have 5 columns and 2 rows. Next, let's format the table. And finally, let's add some headings. That's our macro completed. So we go across to Developer, Stop Recording. Now let's go into Visual Basic to see what we've ended up with. When you use the recorder, it creates a module called New Macros. And obviously we specified that we wanted it to go into our template. And here's our new macro. So we'll begin by copying all of this into our section 4 module. And we can then lose new macros. So what we'll now do is to divide this code into separate sections. And obviously in reality you would be working with longer sections of code, but the principle would be the same. So this section relates to the creation of the document itself. So let's cut this section and paste it into a separate subroutine. Because this subroutine will not be a macro in its own right, we use the keyword private. So 0401b, and we'll call it create document. Then we can paste in our code, and let's just modify it slightly. So at the moment, all of this will happen in the active document. Let's say we want it to happen in a new document. So at the start of this subroutine, we can just add in the statement that creates a new document. Documents.add. So obviously when you create a new document, it becomes the active document, and all of this will then happen within that document. Now, one thing we're not going to do in this example is to work with variables. We'll put variables on a back burner for a couple of videos. The reason is, when you're working with multiple modules, you have to address a separate issue, which is the question of variable scope. In other words, the places from within each module from which each variable can actually be accessed. So we won't work with variables for a couple of videos, and then we'll address the topic later. Okay, let's go back to our code and look at the next section that we want to create. So here the table is being created, and here it's being formatted. So let's put both of those into one subroutine. So we'll cut all of these lines. And create our second private sub. So this is create table. And paste. And then finally we have this section where we actually enter the headings. Let's call that create headings. And then we just need to call each of these sub-procedures. We can get rid of all these comments. So here we just need to use the optional keyword call, and it's always useful to use it so it stands out, so you can immediately see where each subroutine or function is being called. Control V. Control C, of course. And there we have it. So this is a classic setup whereby you have a main subroutine and it then calls several subordinate subprocedures. So the macro is the one whose name is simply preceded by sub, and then everything that's preceded by private sub is only available within this module to other subprocedures, in this case to the main subprocedure. You can of course test each of these independently. Whether or not it works will depend on what that particular section of code does. For example, one private sub may require certain things to be in place before that code actually makes any sense. So normally it's only the main subprocedure in this setup that you actually test and run. So let's go ahead and run. And let's look at the document that's been created for us. So there we have document 2, and we've got our heading 1, and we have our table. So that seems to be working fine. We can say don't save. And on this occasion, we've lived dangerously. In other words, we haven't been saving our code. Under normal circumstances, I would always advise, of course, that you save everything you do. But on this occasion, let's abandon document 1. So do you want to save your changes to document 1? No, we don't. But then it's going to ask us if we want to save our changes to the Word VBA training template, and this time we click on Save. A simple way of modularizing your code is to create a macro which then calls a series of subordinate subroutines. When defining a subroutine designed to be called by other subroutines, precede its name with the keywords private sub. To call a subroutine, use the optional keyword call followed by the name of the subroutine.